And welcome back. In the last video we left off with cleaning our cylinder heads, and we'll get back to that. We'll get back to the next step on that, which is we're now to the point where we're going to install new valve stem seals, and then we're going to start the build up and basically reassemble the valves back into the cylinder heads. And this is when we start to deviate a little bit from stock, so things start to get interesting. But what I wanted to show you here was the contents of what I ordered online, which was called an upper engine seal kit from Mopar. Now this was a little bit hard to get a hold of just due to the supply shortages. I ordered this very early in the year, and it took about, I want to say about 8 to 10 weeks in order to get this. And I thought it might be interesting to show you exactly what comes inside this kit. So I wanted to start with showing you the part number there. And I opened this kit today because I was looking for the valve stem seals. I did find them inside the kit. They're inside of that bag. Now that particular part number may not be something you can order separately. I'm not sure, because you'll notice that says that's a sub pack for the overall kit and has the same part number of the kit. I'm sure you could probably get this seal kit separately, though. I just don't know the part number, unfortunately. But inside of this sub pack, that is one of your valve cover seals for these spark plug wells, kind of shaped like a peanut. You'll see the green seals in here, which these are your intake seals, which are also in this same bag. And inside of this bag, like I stated earlier, has got the valve stem seals, and it looks like that is a separate part number, so you may be able to order these valve stem seals by that part number you see there. You get 2 bags of these, 8 per bag, and you can see that's the same part number, 5302-2090AB. Yeah, 2090AB-008. So these are what we need to finish this. Oh, I'm sorry. As well as, so you get your intake seals and your valve cover spark plug well seals, your valve stem seals. You can see here what we got sitting on. You get both of your head gaskets. You also get the valve cover seal itself, the one that goes on the outer edge of that valve cover. And you also get your exhaust manifold gaskets. I'm not quite sure why an exhaust manifold gasket would be included in an upper engine seal kit, but okay. Now, unfortunately, in my case, you can see this one here did not fare well in shipment. It got pretty distorted on the edges. Now, that might be okay once you put the bolts in there and tighten that down, but not knowing that this seal was included with this kit, or not looking close enough to notice that, I should say, I went ahead and ordered separate exhaust manifold gaskets. So I'll look at those, and hopefully they're in better condition, and I'll use the ones that are in better condition rather than this one here, which again, as you can see, looks like it did not fare well in shipment. It got pretty bent out on that side and that side. And again, feel free to please make a comment on that. I mean, again, that might be perfectly normal to okay to use once you put the bolts in it and put some tension on it and kind of mush all that back down. But you'll notice the other one here, also being multi-layered steel, seems to not be as bad. But again, I did not know that that came with the upper engine seal kit, so I have different ones on the shelf, and I'll use those if they're in better condition. So to recap, you get your bag of seals, which has got your intake manifold seals on it, your valve cover seals for your spark plug wells, your valve stem seals, your valve cover border seals or edge seals, however you want to call them, but your main valve cover seals. you get both of your head gaskets, and you get your exhaust manifold gaskets. So I'm going to pause the video real quick. I'm going to grab some parts here, and I'm going to bring you back and show you what we're going to do for the reassembly of the valves and into the cylinder heads. Talk to you in a bit. And welcome back. Got you over on the bench this time. I got you in the tripod kind of facing down towards the workbench so I can better show you this. But even though we ordered these parts and this is an OEM part, it doesn't hurt to verify that you've got what you need before you go to install, and make sure you were sent the correct one. Now this one here is the original valve stem seal, and this is the new one. Now you're going to see that the opening and the original one looks a bit bigger. Now remember, when we took these off, we bent them and we distorted them a bit to get them out. So, you know, don't let that throw you. But you can see, if I put them edge to the edge, they're the same. And bottom to bottom, they're the same. So I reckon that is the correct part we're looking for. Also, as Scott Rods discovered when he redid his upper part of his motor and he was reinstalling new valve stem seals, a 13 millimeter deep well, because I don't have the actual tool for installing valve stem seals, you'll notice on these particular stem seals, the outer lip, and hopefully you can see that outer metal lip part of that seal will ride very nicely on the lip of this socket. Now this is a 6-point socket. You can see, hopefully you can see that real well. You can see the lip of that seal, that metal lip is riding right on the edge of that socket. So this will do a very nice job of being able to allow us to use this as a seal driver or seal installer to get these installed. And what I'm going to show you next is some of the differences. If you remember, we're going with an upgraded cam and upgraded springs. What you also see here on the bench is some of that new hardware. These springs require spring seats per the tuner. They are Cop Cams spring seats. You can see the part number there. They also required replacement retainers for the springs. Again, Cop Cam part. And you can see those parts here. So these are our spring seats. And these are going to be our new retainers that we'll put on the top of the spring. Again, per my tuner, where I got the kit from, these are all of the recommended replacement parts. So as I said, this is where we start going a little bit different from factory and things start to get pretty interesting. So one of the items that this kit also requires, if you remember the previous kit, when we took the springs off, the existing springs off of the cylinder heads, they had shims on them already. And this particular kit requires the use of different shims. And we'll get into that more when we do a bit of an install showing the actual shims themselves. But there is a note included with the package that on the intake side, they want to use one 60,000th shim with a 0.875 inner diameter first, then a second 60,000th shim with a 0.814 inner diameter, followed by the provided locators. So what's going to happen is, that is our spring seat, if you remember. We're going to have two shims stacked underneath here of different thicknesses and different inner diameters, or slightly different inner diameters, I should say. I'm sorry, on the intake side, correction, on the intake side, per their instruction, it's going to be two 60,000th shims looks like with the inner diameter, slightly different inner diameters. But on the exhaust side, they want to use one 60,000th shim with, again, a 0.875 inner diameter first, then a 15,000th shim with a 0.814 inner diameter second. Again, then followed by the prescribed locators. So we're going to have two shims, we're going to have our seat, our spring, then our cap, and then we'll compress everything and put our keepers in. So inside this kit, and if you caught that in the instructions, in both cases, the very first shim called for on intake and exhaust is going to be 0.060 with a 0.875 inner diameter. Now, what came with the kit was 3 groups of shims tie wrapped together. That's the first group. Second group, which you'll notice are quite a bit thinner. And finally, the last group, which you'll notice are the same thickness as the first. The difference is being we have 16 of these, we have 8 of these, and 8 of the thinner ones. I guess you can kind of see where this is going. Now, remember, intake and exhaust both have the first shim, same size, 0.60 thousandths shim. So what they're referring to is the thickness of the shim. Now, it's been a while. This isn't exactly a calibrated set of dial calipers, and you don't necessarily have to do this, but what I'm going to do is make sure I'm zeroed out here, which I am. I'm going to grab, I'm going to set this to 60 thousandths off camera here, and I'm going to bring you back. That's pretty close. Oop, 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 I'm too far out. There we go. Now, there we go. So what I've done here is zeroed out my dial calipers and just measured this. And that's right about, hopefully that focuses in. Let me read it to you. That's about 62 thousandths. Now, again, this dial caliper isn't exactly dead on. I'm sure it's a couple thousandths off, being as old as it is, and it has been kind of thrown around a little bit. And remember, this is the only group of shims we have 16 of. So based on that thickness measurement, and also now what I'm going to do is use the top of the dial caliper to get an inside measurement of this shim. I realize this is probably incredibly boring. I do apologize, but we're just looking to verify here. So you'll notice, and hopefully you can see that, but we're just shy of 0.9 of an inch. So we're about 8.74. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, about 8.74. And our instructions say that our first shim and both intake and exhaust should be a 60 thousandths thick shim with an inner diameter of 0.875. This comes up at about 62 thousandths and 0.874. Again, to me, and since this is the only one we have 16 of, that confirms that's going to be our first shim on both intake and exhaust. So we've confirmed our part number. We're going to place those off to the side. Now, if we're dealing with the intake side, remember they were calling for two 60 thousandths shims, but with a different inner diameter. Why? I can't begin to have the correct amount of information to tell you that. But we're going to proceed forward with what we've been told per the instructions of the manufacturer that we need to do. Now, again, they're both 60 thousandths, and I can tell you by looking at this group of 8 shims and this group of 16 that they're the same thickness. but we're going to verify that. Again, we're going to take our dial calipers. We're going to set them up to about 60 thousandths, and you can see we're pretty dead on, or pretty close to 60 thousandths. There's a couple thousandths worth of play in there, but that is close enough. Now it's saying that this one, being the second one, should have a 0.814 inner diameter. So again, we're going to go for 0. We're going to back out so we can get a measurement on this inner diameter. And right about there, it's right about 8.1. You can see 8.1, 8.11. So that's pretty close. So that's pretty much tells me that that is the 60 thousandth shim at 0.814 that we are looking at for the intake side. And finally, the last shim needed for the exhaust side, it says it should be a 0.15, 0.1 or 0.015, so 15 thousandths of an inch thick shim. And that's going to be incredibly thinner than a 60 thousandths. And we're coming right up at about 0.16 on our measurement. So that is pretty much our 15 thousandths shim. And it says the inner diameter on that should be 0.814. Once again, we're just going to take a quick measurement here. There we go. Just making sure I get this straight. So we are right about 0.812813. And again, there's going to be a little bit margin of error just because of the dial calipers themselves and how I'm holding this. But again, I'm just looking to get it close to verify. So that verifies to me that that is our 15 thousandths thickness shim and our 0.814 inner diameter. This will be the second shim that we use on the exhaust side. And again, there's only 8 of them. So that confirms to me that's definitely the right part that we're looking for. And you can't see, also one other note, you can't see it on these thinner ones too well, but you can see it on the thicker ones. Just at least this particular type of shim. I'm trying to find a good one to show you here. There we go. You may not be able to see that, but there is a little number that actually is engraved in these rings as well. And you can look at that and use that as a verification of the of your thickness of your shim, because it looks to be, you know, about the same number, or at least it's a part number. Like on this particular shim, to give you an example, it's 6070, and on this shim it comes up as 6060. So we verified that we have our shims. We verified that we have the newer, and also there is a note, just want to cross this out as well as the instructions saying which shims we should have on which sides. There's also a strong note in here. It says, do not use stock shims or locators. Discard them. So we will do just that. Also, again, as we commented before, we've got our retainers and our replacement seats. And you can see that these springs seat very well inside of these seats. So what we're going to do next, I'm going to pause the video here, get one of these heads flipped around, get it prepped, and get it ready to reinstall our valve stem seals. And there's a little bit long-winded explanation on that, but I just wanted to show you that, you know, that was a way that you can verify your shims, but also if you're just looking at the number of count, just due to the fact that both intake and exhaust had the same starting shim, and it's the only shim we have 16 of, then at least there's a safe bet that since this is the only one we had 16 of, this is definitely one we wanted to start with. Now, also, you may be asking yourself the question, well, if I don't have a dial caliper, how do I know which one of these thinner shims was my second one? Well, remember, at least in our case, the second shim for one side was the same thickness as the first one. And again, you can tell by this group of 8 is the same thickness as this group of 16. So that tells me which shim this one is. And the third shim we were looking at was very, very thin, 15 thousandths of an inch instead of 60 thousandths of an inch. And you can obviously tell by looking at the difference between these two that this one's considerably thinner. So that tells me that that's definitely the second shim they were looking for. So it's just another way you can visually kind of compare this, but if you got the dial caliper or another way of doing it, it's not bad to go through and just verify that you do have the correct thicknesses of your shims. Seeing as we are now going beyond the realm of factory here and doing things different, we don't want something to go catastrophically bad. But we're going to get you set up, and then we'll bring you back and install some valve stem seals. And welcome back. So we've got our passenger cylinder head facing towards us, and with it facing towards us, this being our intake side here, this being our exhaust side here, that tells me my cylinder order. Not that it is important at this point in time, it will be when we install the valves in. So again, just kind of keep that in mind of what cylinder head that you're playing with and which orientation that you have it in. As we showed in the previous part of the video, these are our new valve stem seals. We're going to use a 13mm socket. You can kind of see how that fits on there nicely and sits right on that metal lip of that seal to help drive these in place. I'm going to squirt each one of these little valve seal seats down with a little bit of oil, because I don't ever like to install seals dry, plus it'll help our installation process. And what I'm using here is the same oil that would normally be in the engine. Hopefully that comes in okay. This engine calls for 0W40 per the manufacturer, so that's what I'm going to kind of soak these parts down with. If it's good enough for the engine while it's running, then it's good enough for us to use on an install. There we go. That's probably a bit too much, but you know what? Better safe than better to have too much lube than not enough. So we've got that on there. Let's see if I can just kind of seat this by hand first, just to get it started, and it looks like I can. So we're going to take our socket, and we should hear the tone change when we do this. The sound that the hammer is going to make against the socket will be different when that seal finally bottoms out, and we should be able to hear that. Do you hear that? You hear how I'm tapping all around that, and that's now different versus how it started out. We've got that in there. That looks good. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and grab the other one on the opposite side. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to oil it up. And yes, I'm not using gloves. This is clean motor oil. It's a petroleum-based product. Vaseline's also a petroleum-based product, and you put Vaseline on open cuts. Gloves right now for me would kind of get in the way of what I'm doing. Okay, so we've got that on there. We've got our socket in place, and once again, we should hear the tone on this change. Let me get that a little bit straighter. There we go. again, I'm not hitting that with a lot of force either. You'll notice my hand is up at the top of the hammer. I'm using the weight of the hammer more for its weight. So you'll notice, I hope you heard that tone change on that second one, and you'll hear that distinctive change when that seal bottoms out and it's sitting where it needs to set. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn you off at this point. I'm going to go ahead and get the rest of these seals installed, and then I'll bring you back when we start putting some valves in. Talk to you in a bit. And welcome back. Apologize for the video flipping on you midstream like this. It's just the way I had to position the camera. So I just wanted to show you real quick that we do have all our valve stem seals installed, and you're looking at the exhaust, one of the exhaust valves right now with the seal on it. Now, since those seals are new, I just want to show you what I'm doing is I'm taking some more engine oil and going around the very end of where these grooves are, where those collets sit that help retain that, just so I don't damage that seal coming through it. So I'm just going to put some oil on this. Running around, and you'll see it come through there in a bit. As soon as I hit the seal, I just rotate it a little bit, and you'll feel it clear. You'll feel that seal clear those ridges as you kind of go through it, and just being a little bit ginger about it, making sure that you know, I don't damage that seal. But I'm going to turn you off, get the camera repositioned, and bring you back, and we'll put the first couple of valve springs on here. Talk to you in a bit. And welcome back. Got you looking at one of the intake valves here. I got the head on its side. I did attempt to order a tool that would set on the valve actuator mounting points, the perches that you see here on either side. That's meant to kind of mount here and compress the spring. I did order a tool in, but completely a fault of my own. I did not look at the description well enough, and the one that I was ordering, although it was for Dodge, it was for a Cummins, not a Hemi. So I've reordered the correct tool, and if it does work, I'll bring it back and show it to you. But in order for us to progress, so we're not, you know, losing 2 or 3 days waiting for a tool to arrive, I'm going to use our big Aries spring compressor that we use to get the springs off to begin with. But if you remember, since we're going some aftermarket parts here, they wanted a couple of shims on first, same thickness, just different inner diameter. They wanted the shim with the bigger inner diameter on first, and you can kind of see both of these side by side. This one's with, you can see that this one's got a bigger inner diameter than this one, so they want this one on first, followed by the smaller diameter, followed by a spring seat, which will go that way. So you'll see all that be sandwiched together. And then, this will be sitting down here. Then we'll put the spring on top of it, and then finally the retainer, and then we'll get some keepers reinstalled. But it looks like you can kind of see. Yeah, you can kind of see that valve a little bit. Let me see if I can kind of lower the camera and twist you here, so you can get a better shot of that valve. There we go. That looks like that got you in there. Hopefully that stays in focus. Because if I turn the camera too much, it's going to do that portrait thing again. Let's try that. There we go. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little bit of motor oil on the seats of these. Again, I just don't want something to go in there dry. We've got that in there, so we want our 60,000th shim with the bigger diameter, which if you look again, look at these two. This is the one we want first. See that one down in there, followed by our next 60 thousandths, just again smaller inner diameter, followed by our spring seat. Let me make sure I don't have any debris. I got a little bit of crud in this one. Let me clean that seat off. Yeah, a little bit of crud. There we go. There's our seat. So hopefully you can see that down in there. So you can see our spring seat there, and then we've got our two shims underneath. Now next up is going to be our spring. Again, I'm probably just being a little bit too paranoid about this, but I'm going to give it just a little bit of oil on that spring seat. We're going to make sure that that seat's in there. I'm actually going to take that spring seat off and just hold it to the bottom of that spring. Put it in there as one assembly, and there we go. Now we're seated. And then we can take our steel retaining cap, get that ready for the top of our spring. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to shut the camera off and kind of reposition things so I can get this spring compressor in here. And then when we have all that, I'll bring it back and show you what I'm going to use to get the little retaining clips. I shouldn't say clips, but retaining collets in place. I'll bring it back. Bring it back in a moment. And welcome back. So as you saw in the previous video, we were getting things ready to install our first set of valve springs, and I mentioned that the tool I bought, and again, all fault of my own, didn't fit the heads because the description said it was for a Cummins and not for a standard hemi. So I've reordered the right tool. I was going to proceed forward with our big Aries spring compressor, but having to hold all the new pieces in place and then clip onto that spring the way that it needs to clip, it's becoming just too problematic to manage. That Aries there, when you put enough pressure on it to now exceed what the new springs are going to call for, it wants to wobble back and forth and not set straight, and it just becomes too much of a pain to deal with. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cut the video here, and unfortunately it's going to be a few days delay until I can get the right spring compressor in, the one that will bolt to those valve arm actuating posts. And once I get that in, I'll restart the video, obviously, and I'll bring you back and show you how that one works. Because what happens is, and it makes it a bit nicer, is that these newer valve stem seals grip onto the valve well enough. It kind of holds it there enough where you can compress it and then put all the keepers and everything on with this cylinder head sitting, you know, flat up towards you rather than kind of on its side, where you kind of have to deal with when you're dealing with that type of a spring compressor. But rather than get more frustrated with it and potentially break something, I'm going to cut it here. We're going to get the correct tool, and I'm going to bring you back, and we'll show you how we're going to get keepers and everything else installed. But I'll chat at you. For you, it'll be a few seconds. For me, it'll be a few days. I'll talk to you later. Bye. And welcome back. As I stated in the previous video, it would be just a couple of seconds for you, but a couple of days for me. And you can see that we do have our first valve spring installed on our intake side here. I'm going to move over and show you what I did on to get this one installed. I'm going to use this next intake valve in the next position over. But what I wanted to show you was, remember, as we were discussing in the last video, because of the shims that are needed, the seat, the new spring, and the cap, means that when these get compressed, they have to be compressed down a pretty good ways to get that valve stem to stick up enough through this retainer to get your keepers on. And the issue I was having with the big Aries tool is that when you clamp it with enough force, since it would push down on the spring on this side and clamp on the other side of the cylinder head, is that the tool would want to kind of rock back and forth across this keeper and not stay, straight, where I wasn't having to hold it in position and try to get the retainers and the keepers in the grooves. Now, I went through a couple of different tools, and like I said in the previous video, this was the first one that I did not, unfortunately, catch it in the description. But this tool here is meant to mount onto these valve actuator posts. But you'll notice that in order to get that to line up to where that's at, you notice the bolt holes doesn't line up. Because, again, I didn't catch it in the description that this one is actually for a Cummins head, not a hemi. So I did order a tool that was listed to work for a Gen 3 hemi, but I wasn't sure if it would work on what I have is what I can find online as being a Gen 4 hemi. Now, while waiting for the new tool to arrive, I did order a couple of these smaller, cheaper ones on Amazon because they were relatively inexpensive. Now, I knew what I was getting into, knowing they were only about $16 to $20-something each in a price point. Not that they're bad, but again, the issue I was running into, even with using something like this, is that you can see where it grabs the spring. And because these are beehive type springs, I'll just grab one out of the box here for you. It would, much like doing a front strut in a vehicle, it was hard to get that tool to grab it evenly. Now, this tool did it best of all because you can see the legs are a little bit offset from each other to try to compensate for where it's going to grab on that spring. But the issue I had was I could get the keeper on the top, compress it with this tool. So what happens is you got your spring here, you've got your keeper on top of that. These two fins, or these two handles here in the center, push down on the top of the keeper and basically compress the spring. So you can compress the spring with this tool, get it together in assembly, come over here, put it in place, and then put your keepers inside of your valve stem grooves, and then release the tension on this. But again, the length at which that spring had to compress to meet specs meant this had to be cranked down pretty far. And although I'm not going to say that it couldn't be done, it could be done, but I had this thing cranked out about as much as I could, grabbing the spring about as low as I could, and still couldn't get enough compression even with this to get everything to seat to get those keepers in. So flash forward that. Now again, that was that tool there. I also tried an OEM tools one, which this one, did work a little bit better, but also ran into the same compression issue. And just for giggles, we also ordered in and tried this one, which, this one worked okay. And again, I'm not saying that they're bad tools and that they don't work, but to each tool its application, and I'm sure there are valve springs out there in which these tools would work just fine. Well, flash forward the next day after trying those out and getting in the tool that does fit, that does work. And this is put out by Powerhouse Performance Essentials, and there's the part number there. It's a POW 352003. Again, I'll say that, POW 352003. This is the one that is listed for being able to do a Gen 3 Hemi. And I can confirm, you can see it there, it does work for doing this Gen 4 cylinder head. And again, from what I can see online, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I can see online that they're saying the 2016 is a Gen 4. But regardless of that, it does fit. I'm going to show it to you here. But the first thing we're going to do is that we're going to prep this. I'm going to get you in the stand now, so I can show you the rest of this without having to hold the camera at the same time. So forgive me while we put you in your face mask. Okay, let me see how close I can get you. If I have to, I'll pull the cylinder head a little bit to the edge, a little bit more to the edge here. I've also got to get my hands in here to be able to work. Okay, there we go. We'll go with that. So the first thing I'm going to do is put some oil onto this seat here, much like we did before. Again, just putting a little bit of lubrication in here so things don't go together dry. And then when we get to the point right before we put the valve covers back on, later on in the assembly process, we're going to slather everything down in here in oil. Okay, now if you remember, we're doing an intake one, so we need our shims. We need a 60,000th shim, that's 0.875, which again is our common shim. We actually have 16 of these. I'm going to go ahead and put that one on. And then we need our 60,000th shim. That is 0.814, so same thickness, smaller diameter. And you're going to see where this shim fits pretty snug right around this piece here in the center. So now that we have that one on, now we need our new spring seat, which is this piece here. And again, I'm just going to put a little bit of oil on that. And probably not necessary at all, but I'm going to do it anyway. There we go. There's our spring seat. Now we need our retaining cap for the top. And then we're going to need our tool and 2 of these collets, or these retaining clips, however you want to call them. Now, one thing on these retaining clips you'll note, hopefully you can see it there well, is that you'll notice they're a little bit wider on one end than the other. When you're putting these back in, or at least for this application, I'll try to show you here with the top of the retainer. Basically, the narrower end goes in first. And when I drop it there in the keeper, you'll see what I'm talking about. You'll see how that fits in there and fits snug. If you try putting these in where the wider end goes in first, you'll see this retainer that it doesn't fit. It doesn't fall into place. So when we're putting these in and putting these in on the valve stem and getting them to stick, again, we're going to take that smaller end, which is this end here. You'll notice this one's a little bit wider than this one. We're going to put this smaller end facing down, so that way when this retainer comes up, it grabs hold of that. And let me go grab a spring here. Again, I'm going to put a little bit of oil on the bottom of the spring. Again, just a little bit, not much. There we go. I'm going to put our new spring in. And what I'm doing on the bottom of this cylinder head to keep those valves from potentially falling or pushing out is I'll show it to you, but I've got some shop towels, these same blue shop towels that you see the cylinder head resting on. I just got a handful of them wadded up, and the cylinder head is, so basically you got a wad of these paper towels right up underneath the valves, and the weight of the cylinder head is keeping everything nice and compressed. What I'm going to use next is this guy right here. I'm going to bring our compressing tool in. This is going to start to limit some of your view here, and I'll see about getting the camera adjusted. Now you can slide this back and forth, so remember that, because you're going to want to kind of get this lined up to where it needs to be. And this tool comes with this cage assembly that goes on the bottom, and I'm going to move the camera out of here a bit, goes in the bottom of this forcing screw. And I'm going to go ahead and take this forcing screw out so I can show you what they have on the bottom of this. There we go. You see they just got a little ball bearing on the bottom of that forcing screw that meets up with the little dimple that's on the bottom of this cage. And by sliding this left and right, I'm going to take our retainer, put it on the top of our valve spring, and I'm going to squeeze this cage in there. And this is a bit of a tight fit, I'm not going to lie. With the addition of all the shims and the other items on the bottom of this tool does fit, but it is a bit snug of a fit. As you can see, it takes me backing that forcing screw out a little bit. I'm going to put this forcing screw down just enough to where it starts to put a little bit of pressure on there, but I'm not going to start tightening this yet. I'm just looking for alignment. What I'm looking for is the stem of the valve, that it comes up through the center of the spring and the keeper and the tool, because I don't want to catch the edge of that valve and start to push things downward. And it looks like that might be it. Okay, so now I'm just going to tighten down these hold down screws that would normally, again, it's just bolting to that same bolt holes that valve actuating rail would mount to. I'm doing a bad job of remembering what the name of that is. I'm not going to go too terribly tight. I'm just going to snug them. I mean, you want them snug enough that that's not going to pull out under pressure, but you also don't want to go too far with it either, because you're going to see how much we actually have to compress that spring in order to get those keepers in. And in case you're wondering, the bolts they supplied with that you saw me tightening are 13 millimeter, and that forcing bolt in the center is 16 millimeter. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to pause the camera here and reposition you, so try to get a better shot of what's going to go on in the center here when we put these keepers back into this valve stem and allow the retainer to grab it. And I'll bring you back here in a second. Okay, so I got you repositioned on the tripod here. I think we're good to go. I dropped a little bit of oil on the forcing screw for that compressor, just to kind of extend our life a little bit. And I'm going to start cranking down on this center screw, which you'll see that spring start to compress. Okay, there we go. Yeah, we got enough of it compressed at that point to get those keepers on. I'm sorry, to get those collets on. And you can see how far down that had to compress. Now, having to compress the spring that far that was what was leading to problems for me trying to use the big Aries compressor to get in there, because with that much spring tension on it, again, that tool wanted to pivot on the top of that retainer. Made it a bit pain to deal with. What I'm using, let me try to get that in the shot here. Hopefully that stays in focus. Is just Lucas Red and Tacky. There you go, right there, big and bold in your face. And I'm just using that as the grease on the inside of these collets to help hold them in place while we release the tension on that spring compressor. Now remember earlier when we were looking at this, when we put these in, we want the smaller, kind of the pointy side of this, or the narrower side of these, I should say, to be facing down. Let me get a bit more schmutz in there, just to help hold it in place. And yes, I did get all this all over my fingers. Hopefully you can see that in there. I just got a little bit of grease in there. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to try to keep this in your view. Again, narrow side down. Put it up against that valve stem. You saw it there. And I'm just going to take a little pocket screwdriver. You can use a pocket screwdriver. You can use a pick. And you can just kind of, or with your finger, what I'm doing here. I'm just going to push that keeper around. I should say retainer around. And then I'm going to juice up the other one and stick it on that same side. There we go. And again, we're going to go, accidentally removed my grease. Caught it with my finger. So let's just reload that. It's probably way too much, but again, too much lube is not necessarily in some circumstances a bad thing. So there we go. So you can see that I now have that second keeper. I keep saying keeper, I apologize. In there, or I should say retaining clip in there. So now what we should be able to do is take the tension off of our compressing tool, and the retainer should grab a hold of those collets. There we go. You can see we got our valve installed. And so far I'm loving this compressor. This is by far much easier, in my opinion, as you saw, to deal with. It keeps your hands free to be able to do other things. There we go. You can see we've got our second intake spring installed, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and just continue to work down this line, getting the rest of these intake springs installed. Then I'll come back and do the exhaust. I won't film that and show it to you to be a bit boring, but on the exhaust side it's the exact same process, except it uses, remember, it uses the 60 thousandths 0.875 inner diameter shim. So the same as the intake, except on the exhaust side of it, the second shim is this much thinner 15 thousandths shim with a 0.814 inner diameter. So this one, thicker one, would go on first, followed by this thinner one, and it would have the same spring seat there, and of course the process of installing it would be exactly the same. So I'm not going to bore you with that, but I wanted to show you that, yes, this tool from Powerhouse, again, I'll have a link in the description of where I got it on Amazon, that it does work. It did work on these heads, and as you saw, it does work phenomenally well. And I'll bring it back when this cylinder head's complete. Thank you much. Bye. And as promised, I forgot, I wanted to show you this before I ended the video, but I just want to show you what I'm using. As I described earlier, it's just a wad of these blue shop towels. I'm just putting them underneath the valves and then flipping the cylinder head over and just using the weight of the cylinder head and these to help hold the valves in place so they don't slide down. But that's it. I'll bring it back when it's done. And welcome back. As you can see, we've got our springs installed on both intake and exhaust. So as far as this cylinder head is concerned, and this is the passenger cylinder head, it's complete as far as the valve reassembly and the new springs, shims, seats, and retainers. The little collets, the little keepers, were reused from the previous setup. But we'll go ahead and get the driver's side cylinder head taken care of. Obviously, I'm not going to make a video of that one because it would be just more of the same thing and be a little redundant. But just to show you that again, as far as what I'm using to hold the keepers or collets in place until we relieve the tension and let the retainer grab a hold of it, is just Lucas red and tacky grease. I bought a grease gun tube of it because the 1 pound container my parts store didn't have, but they did have this and it's the same thing, so that's why I'm using it. And this tool, once again, which worked phenomenally well, is a Powerhouse POW 352003. Once again, I'll put the Amazon link in the description of where I was able to order that. Like I said, we'll get cracking on the driver's side cylinder head, and then we'll get on to the next piece. Once we have the cylinder heads completely reassembled, we'll finish taking the oil pump and the old timing set off of the existing motor. Then we'll see about pulling the old cam and getting the new cam and new timing set and everything installed. But getting the cylinder head done is nice. It's nice to see progress, let me put it that way. So getting this piece of it done kind of just helps push you forward into getting other things done. But thank you for watching this, what is the rather long-winded video, but I kind of wanted to show you some of the things that you might get into when you start deviating from stock, which we are here, and which we're using, you know, aftermarket springs, and going with a different cam. It changes the profile of things. It changes how these springs need to, basically, in order to get these springs to work with this head, that's why you see and hear all the shimming that we're talking about, to get things to be at the correct height that they need to be. But I'm not going to bore you anymore. I'm going to let you go for now. Like I said, we're going to get to work on that driver's side cylinder head, and then we'll bring you back when we start tearing some more pieces off the motor. Until then, thank you.